Have you ever wondered why some truly horrific historical events fundamentally change a nation's DNA while others are, well, seemingly pushed to the margins of history? Welcome to this explainer. Today we're going to uncover the hidden sociological forces that shape exactly how entire societies process major historical events, and we're going to break down the actual mechanics behind that process.
Okay, let's dive right into this. Our journey today is grounded in a truly foundational text called Cultural Trauma and Collective Identity. It's written by Jeffrey C. Alexander alongside an esteemed group of sociologists. Now, this is a groundbreaking piece of work that fundamentally shifts how we understand collective suffering. It is a bit dense and very academic, but don't worry, we're going to break the whole thing down into incredibly clear, digestible insights.
So, here is our roadmap. We'll start by debunking the myth of natural trauma, define what cultural trauma actually is, and explore the trauma creation process. Then, we'll look at how narratives are constructed, map out the arenas of meaning-making, and finally, wrap up by examining how all this shapes collective identity.
Section 1. The Myth of Natural Trauma. Unlearning Lay Trauma Theory.
Now, what's really interesting about this concept is that before we can understand the sociological reality, we actually have to unlearn what most of us intuitively assume. In our everyday, common-sense view, what they call lay trauma theory, bad things happen and the sheer force of those events just naturally shatters a group's well-being. Boom, trauma. But the sociological approach argues something entirely completely different. Events are not inherently traumatic to a culture. Instead, trauma is a constructed narrative. It requires active human meaning-making.
To understand that lay theory a little bit better, let's look at this quote by Arthur Neal. He perfectly captures what our authors call the Enlightenment version of this idea. He suggests that an extraordinary event creates such massive disruption that ignoring it just isn't an option for rational people. The basic assumption here is that trauma is an unavoidable automatic reaction. But our primary sources argue that this is actually flawed. Why? Because it completely ignores the human agency required to actively label an event as a trauma.
Section 2. What is cultural trauma? The sociological reality.
So the crucial point is this. If trauma doesn't just happen naturally, then what exactly is it? Well, cultural trauma occurs when a group feels subjected to a horrendous event that leaves indelible marks upon their group consciousness, irrevocably changing their future identity. You see, it's not just about experiencing physical pain or going through an economic crash. It's about when that pain enters the very core of a collectivity's sense of who they are. Trauma, at this level, is a socially mediated attribution.
The authors actually call the opposite of this the naturalistic fallacy. We absolutely must reject the idea that events inherently create collective trauma all on their own. To bridge the gap between a horrendous event and its representation as a trauma, human agents have to actively attribute traumatic status to it. You essentially have to actively turn a social crisis into a cultural crisis.
Section 3. The Trauma Creation Process. The Spiral of Signification.
And this brilliantly illustrates the mechanics of it all. If creating trauma requires active human agency, how does a society actually manufacture it? Well, think of the process like a speech act. You need three specific things. First, a speaker. Sociologists call this the carrier group. These are collective agents, maybe elites or marginalized leaders, who are broadcasting a claim of fundamental injury. Second, you need an audience. That's the wider public that actually needs to be convinced. And third, the situation, the historical and institutional environment where this is all happening. So the carrier group is essentially trying to persuade the wider public that they have in fact been traumatized.
Section 4. Constructing the narrative. The 4 pillars of classification.
To create a new master narrative that a whole society actually adopts, a carrier group has to successfully establish 4 key pillars. First, the nature of the pain. What actually happened? For instance, was American slavery framed merely as a coercive economic system, or was it a brutal physical domination? Second, the nature of the victim. Who exactly suffered? Third, the relation of the trauma victim to the wider audience. And fourth, the attribution of responsibility. Who is the antagonist here? Was it just a corrupt regime, or were ordinary citizens complicit too? And keep in mind, every single one of these pillars is fiercely contested.
Now that third pillar is particularly fascinating. It asks, is the suffering of others also our own? You see, for a trauma claim to actually succeed, the wider audience must symbolically identify with the victimized group. They have to look at the victims and see qualities they value in themselves. They have to expand the circle of the we. Because if the audience refuses to see that connection, the trauma narrative simply fails to take hold across the broader society.
Section 5. Arenas of meaning-making. The institutional battlegrounds.
Let's see how this builds out into the real world. Because this contest over narrative doesn't just happen in a vacuum. It takes place within powerful, structured societal institutions. If a carrier group takes their claim to the legal arena, it's all about binding judgments and material reparations. If it enters the aesthetic arena like literature, movies, or theater, it's about imaginative identification and emotional catharsis. State bureaucracies use official commissions of inquiry to channel the process, while mass media offers expressive dramatizations, though it's restricted by news reporting constraints. Each and every one of these arenas has its own distinct rules for validating trauma.
And history gives us some incredible examples of this in action. The Nuremberg trials utilized the legal arena to establish war crimes, though interestingly, it didn't automatically force the German public to identify with the victims. Then you have the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was a massive state arena effort to generalize trauma across a deeply polarized society. In Guatemala, local theater productions served as aesthetic arenas providing much-needed catharsis. Now contrast all of those with the 1938 rape of Nanking. A horrific mass extermination occurred, absolutely, but it largely failed to become a globally generalized cultural trauma at the time. Why? Because the carrier groups lacked the necessary resources to broadcast the narrative effectively.
Section 6, Shaping Collective Identity, the Aftermath.
So, what happens after these massive institutional battles are fought and a cultural trauma is finally successfully accepted? Well, Sigmund Freud once described psychological trauma as a foreign body that is still at work long after its entry. The authors take this psychological concept and connect it directly to the cultural level. Once a collective memory of trauma truly takes root in a society, it becomes indelible. It is quite literally a wound that permanently alters the collective identity, forcing that society to continually re-remember its past.
But of course, a society cannot live forever in a constant state of heightened, highly emotional discourse. It'd be exhausting. Eventually, a period of calming down occurs, which sociologists call routinization. That intense initial shock flattens out and becomes objectified. It settles into our physical, everyday world through monuments, museums, and historical artifacts. Think of something like Cambodia's Tuol Sleng Museum. The trauma becomes institutionalized into permanent, structured memories to educate future generations, and that effectively anchors the new collective identity. So as we've seen today, cultural trauma is not just a natural, automatic occurrence. It is a profound, deeply complex, and socially constructed process that redefines moral responsibility and social solidarity for an entire group. So I want to leave you with this question to ponder. Look at your own society, your own nation. What cultural traumas have shaped your we? What narratives have been constructed around you? And perhaps more importantly, what suffering has been denied? Keep questioning, keep learning, and we will see you next time.